Alright, here we are with another video. I've been sitting on this for a little bit, waiting to see what comes of the COVID-19, trying to read up on all the information that the World Health Organization, CDC, is putting out. I'm trying to ignore the news because they have no clue what they're doing. You have a bunch of guys that are just reading teleprompters, and they do that poorly, and they have no clue what they're talking about. If you follow the World Health Organization's, the CDC, and read their articles and everything, you'll see that a lot of what they're talking about is they use words like might and maybe and could and potentially, and during some of the interviews when they're asked it, direct questions for certain things, like they'll tell you that they don't know. We can't predict that right now, or uh, they're just very uncertain about what's coming. And with the experts being uncertain and unsure, that's going to leave the average person with some fear, anxiety, apprehension over what's to come. And so this video is going to be about what could potentially come. And there's pretty much right now, there's two possible outcomes. The first one, and the one I hope it is that this is just a simple warning. And what do I mean by that? A warning as of things to come. I believe that you get small little warnings, small little problems prior to something major happening. You have a few close calls, when you're driving down the street before you have your major accident. Yes, you can have a major accident straight off the bat without a little warning, but you usually have those small little warnings prior. And if you don't correct things, that's when you get the big one. And so this COVID-19 has the potential to be just a warning. And if you understand how flus work and how they go about, which I'll explain here in a minute, you'll see how this could potentially be a warning. The other one is it being a straight up actual pandemic. Big words, brings in a lot of scary connotations. But what you got to realize is that in the past 100 years, we've had 3 pandemic flus, if you include this one. So it's not as scary as it should be, but at the same time, it's not as scary as they're making it out. What I mean by not as scary as it should be, if you look at the Spanish flu, the last major one that really took its toll on people, you had something in the neighborhood of 500 million people infected, right? And they say that that's about a third of the world's population. Okay? Which, we're at a much bigger population right now, so that wouldn't seem like much. But if you use the third part, and we're almost at 8 billion right now. So a third of that 8 billion would be almost 3. It'd be in the neighborhood of 2.5, something around that. 2.5, 2.75 billion, which is a lot higher than this number. And that's just what was infected, that we know of, because they didn't have accurate ways of counting and keeping track. In some areas, they had a lot of people infected. It's just they didn't notify all the rest of the countries, because a lot of the countries were isolated, especially the more primitive countries in South America, Africa, parts of Australia, India, like Tibet, the Middle East, because they didn't have, like, the Spanish flu happened in 1918, right? So they didn't have the telephone, they didn't have the World Wide Web. Well, they had a telephone, but not everybody had the telephone. Only the richest countries had electricity. They had motorized vehicles, but only the rich had them. And they did have trains in large parts of the world. They did have telegraph in probably 30 to 40% of the world, but for the most part, they're very disconnected. So this number potentially is a lot higher than what it is. But they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million dead. Okay, so again, going back to how disconnected and how they didn't really share a lot of information because they couldn't or just didn't think it was important. This number, the 50 million dead, could actually be a lot higher. And what was unique about the Spanish flu or the 1918 flu, 1918 pandemic, is that you had adults ages 20 to 40 who were healthy dying. They had a very high mortality rate in that age range, which most others, they hardly ever even getting sick. So that's what made that one unique. So we've had pandemics before. Like I said, 3 in the past century. So, these numbers, if we're going off roughly a third, 50 million, if COVID-19 turns out to be as deadly, which it doesn't seem like it's going to be, 50 million, like, this would be small. 500 million would be a small number of deaths. Like I said, at least 2.5, 2.75. I'm not going to try to do the math off the top of my head, but, that'd be billions infected and then at least, 500 million to a billion dead. But you got to realize there's something different nowadays than what we had back in. Okay, back in 1918, they didn't have vaccines. They didn't have a lot of the modern medical stuff that we have now. But they did practice social isolations, quarantine, hygiene the best they could, and it pretty much kept this number very, very, very low. Nowadays, yes, we have all these things, but we're also living in higher population densities, which is going to allow it to travel faster. And when it travels faster, what little resources we actually have as far as vaccines and medical treatment, that gets overwhelmed too quickly. And most people are not going to get any type of treatment whatsoever. And that's what they're talking about a lot in the news and social media and stuff like that, is about flattening the curve. It's, about slowing that spread as much as possible, that this virus, to allow us to restock resources in between, major outbreaks of however many people in an area. So that is important. But right now, calling this a pandemic, I necessarily wouldn't. But that's just me. I'm not in charge of anything around the world, so it's not up to me. Most people will agree that it's not a pandemic when you consider that your average annual flu has done more damage than this COVID, but like the H5N1 had a 22% fatality rate, and yet this one right now is sitting right around 3 in third world countries with very little medical knowledge and treatment. Your average American has more medical knowledge than most of the so-called doctors in some of these countries. So, it's not that bad. It has the potential to be bad, but right now it's not that bad. Um, so it could be a pandemic, but it doesn't look like it's getting there. But it doesn't mean it won't. So if it's not a pandemic, then it goes back to it being a warning. Okay, and this warning is basically, it's a warning of overpopulation. It's a warning of things to come. And it's a small sign before the major sign, which would be this baby right here. If we use the 8 billion number, then we're talking about maybe 1 billion dead, right? Which is huge, right? It's absolutely massive. So, that's a lot of people. That's a ridiculous amount of people to be dead. And I don't want to have to deal with the cleanup. Like, that's just going to be nasty, So, with it being a warning, appearing to be a warning right now, we can't honestly say it's not a pandemic, because it could just be ramping up. Have a slow start and then just all of a sudden peaks. We won't know anything until spring. And the reason why I say that is because that's how the flu goes. It kicks off in the fall. And do a crude little drawing. It'll kick off in the fall and start ramping up, and throughout winter it'll kind of level off. Then spring, when things start warming up, less and less of this can survive on surfaces and with the warmer temperatures, so it rapidly just tanks down to zero. And that's why you never really hear of anybody coming down with the flu mid-July. It just doesn't happen. And it's kind of like in a rest dormant state, because the viruses that are out there on surfaces and stuff like that are dead. They're getting killed from the heat. UV radiation, from the sun, has been proven to kill a lot of things. And what few does still exist and is surviving in some cold, dark place, it hasn't been disturbed yet. And it's just waiting for the perfect time back in the fall before it starts ramping up again. And my concern with this COVID stuff is that if it is a new flu, that we're most likely not going to have a natural immunity to it. And so what's going to be left is for our body to come up with its own immunity, its adaptive immunity. If you look up how immune systems work and responses, you'll learn about that. I'm not going to go into detail with that on this video because it's a lot of information. But your body adapts by one of two ways. Basically, briefly touch on one. It just throws a bunch of things at it. Some scientists say it's like shotgunning. Your body just floods itself with all these chemicals and hopes it kills it. The only problem with that side of it is you tend to your body tends to get beat up, and there are people who die from it. And that's one of the reasons why you feel like shit when you have the flu, is because your body's just throwing shit at it. So there's also damage being done by the virus, like inside your nostrils, the lining being damaged by the virus, and so that's why you start leaking fluid out of it. Your muscles being damaged if it's the virus is in your blood, and that's why you have the body aches. And so. The virus is doing damage to your body, but your body also does damage to itself trying to get this virus. It's a last-ditch effort to try to get this virus. And, it could potentially kill you. It's very rare, if you're got different immune compromise, you're on certain medications, if your body's just not in great health, it could. Healthy people, not something to worry about. The other way your body fights off of something is by adapting to it and creating its own little specialized workers, which is what vaccines are supposed to do. Because they inject the vaccine, the dead virus, whatever it is, bacteria, whatever it is, into your body. In this case, it'd be the virus into your body, and your body learns how to specifically attack it. And so when it actually does come into your body's like, oh, I've seen this before. Release this, and it releases it in a massive dose and just overwhelms it and kills it. And if our body does not have a natural immunity to it, we're going to have to come up with a vaccine. And that takes time. But the good thing is, if this is just a warning, during this lull, this downtime in the spring and summer, we have time to get things ready and ramped up, because we know it's going to spring back up in the fall. It always does. Flus, weird flus, strands of flus always does. And so there's going to be a big push by medical industries to have all these vaccines ready, for people to get their freaking next flu shots, And you're going to start over the summer, you're going to hear a bigger push for it if this COVID stuff doesn't get too much worse. If it gets worse, then it's going to go from warning to pandemic, and we're going to have bigger issues to deal with immediately. So right now, it's looking like a warning. And this warning is because it's mainly because we're overpopulated. I have the pleasure of last week of traveling through some of the bigger cities. I went downtown Manhattan, Brooklyn's, Bronx, Queens area. The air was so much cleaner because the smog was gone. But the filth that was there, that is normally masked by the smog and being in a hurry to get out of people's way because everybody's elbow to elbow pushing through the streets. Cars are jam-packed. It's taking freaking an hour to go across this small little city when you can walk across it in less time. I had the pleasure of going through there and seeing the vacant streets, almost no traffic, almost nobody out. I had to do it because it's like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It's probably not going to ever get back to that unless it's an actual pandemic. And so, with the overpopulation, you got to think of it as basically a giant petri dish. If you understand how petri dishes are and how they work, they have this gel in there. It's agar gel or agarose gel, and that's made from seaweed, type of seaweed, and it has nutrients that viruses, bacteria, and stuff like that. The bacteria need to survive. When they put viruses in there, they generally grow a culture of bacteria for the viruses to feed on. Basically feed on, because viruses cannot replicate themselves. They need a living organism that can replicate, and they attach to them. They get their RNA or DNA inside of it and then allow that organism to replicate it, and then it bursts or releases, and it spreads. Well, a lot of these gels, in order to grow viruses, they do contain blood. And so with me saying a city, especially an overpopulated city, is a giant petri dish. We have the virus, we have the bacteria is growing everywhere. You can smell it. If you go downtown Manhattan right now, you can smell the bacteria, and that's prime ground for viruses. And the thing with viruses is, when they inject their RNA or DNA into something to have that replicate it for itself, it doesn't replicate correctly. And that's where we get the mutations. And that's where we get these weird ass strands that all of a sudden become 10 times more lethal than other strands, is because it doesn't replicate correctly. And so there's a little bit of science there for you, but that tells you how bad a city can be, because you can have in a single city 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 different mutations of the same virus happening all at once. And all it takes is one to get us here. Because all it took was one for the 1918 Spanish flu. 50 million people dead. Today's numbers, it would be 1 billion, which is very bad because you have no control of it. And so, if this is just a warning, which again, it most likely is, but just in case it's not, there's pretty much one thing that has consistently saved people throughout history, whether it was the bubonic plague, or these flus that pop up all the time, different outbreaks in different areas of different things. There's one thing, and one thing only, that has consistently saved groups of people. And that is staying away from other people. If you're not sick, you stay away from the people that are sick, guess what? You don't get sick. It seems like a no-brainer. And, people are saying that's a little too simple. It is too simple, but at the same time, it's not. For a lot of friends of mine who live out in the countryside, who only come into town once a week or once every other week, it's super simple for them. They don't have nothing to do. But what if you lived in downtown Manhattan, downtown LA, Detroit, wherever there's just millions of people in a small area? For those people, I say your planning should have been done by now. And I've constantly said for years, you should always plan ahead, think ahead. With either one of these scenarios, if it turns out to be either one of these scenarios, which we're left at a waiting game to see how it goes. You have to stop waiting. You have to get your food and water set. You have to get your medical supplies and first aid set. You can't wait no longer. Because if it's just a warning, well, that's great. But you have stuff for later, for next fall, when it may not be a warning. If it is a pandemic, well, then, you should have been set already. You have to stay away from people. And the easiest way for us to do that is to have food, water, and medical supplies and be isolated. One thing we need constantly is food and water. We don't need clothes regularly. You can walk around butt naked and it not be a problem. But you have to eat every day. You have to drink water every day. If you're on medication, you have to have that every day, or however often you take it. So you need to have that in place by now. So that's the only way you're going to be able to stay away from people. All these people that are out and about still, when I was downtown Manhattan, they were going to or from getting medical supplies or food supplies. The water, they had running water at home, so they didn't really need that. Depending on your area, you may or may not need to do that. I recommend having, if I lived in Manhattan, which would be foolish knowing that a pandemic is coming, I would have at least a month's supply of food, because with the flu, that's enough to kind of outlive it. There'll still be pockets of it here and there, but you're going to outlive it basically. If you live in a smaller city, in a rural community, get farther out if you can, if you have that luxury. Because the wilderness is going to be your only safety. because out there, it's not a giant petri dish. It may seem like it because you're like, well, there's bacteria everywhere. Yes, but they're healthful bacteria. There's stuff that naturally kills these viruses, or these viruses can't replicate in, or they destroy what bacteria these viruses replicate and potentially mutate in, right? So that's why the Ebola doesn't spread until people come into the freaking area. Because generally with viruses, they have one species that they can attack. Like human HIV. It only attacks human. But there's also strands of chimpanzee HIV. There's also a strand of feline HIV. But you can't get those because we are not felines or chimpanzees. So with viruses, they generally attack one species or a very closely related group of species. So, because there's potential for a human chimpanzee HIV to mutate just enough to where it can affect both people. And if you know anything about HIV, it's a very rapidly mutating virus because it's unstable. It doesn't replicate correctly. But at the same time, there's people who can have it in them for years and not have any symptoms because it's not currently killing them because it's trying to adapt to their body. It's just one of those things. With the flus generally adapt a lot faster. And, they don't take years. They usually take a few weeks, and then they're either killed you or your body's been able to fight it off. So if you stay away from people and have your food, water, medical, first aid stuff, you're going to be good, even if it is a pandemic. Friends and family and yourself, you also need training, okay? Because you need to be able to think and plan ahead, which is a type of mental training that most people nowadays suck at. They absolutely suck at. People know they should have a little extra food, a little extra medicine than what they're going to need, but they don't do it. And part of it's laziness. They lack discipline. With a little bit of training, you can get that. There's other trainings that you need to do to take into account too, like growing your own food. That extends your food supply. If you can grow your own food, and you got the supplies for it, bam, now you have a continual source of food. But you'd be surprised how many people can't plant a simple garden and just make it productive. It always dies. And so I consider that very valuable training to get too. The biggest one is training in cleaning protocols, right? Keeping yourself clean. Like if you do have to go out into the city, like say this COVID is a nasty thing, it is a pandemic, and not something just totally trumped up, then you're going to need your gloves. You're going to need clothing. You're going to need your mask and eye shields because you don't want somebody coughing and getting to your eyes and getting into your body. So you need training on how to wear those correctly, do things correctly, and you need to be able to take them off and sanitize them correctly. It's not as easy as you think. It can be complex. It does take a little bit more time. It could take 20, 30 minutes. When you come home, you don't just go inside, take everything off, and I'm good, because now you just brought it inside. Like, if you look how a lot of the Eastern cultures go, they don't even come inside with their shoes, because if you think about it, the bottom of the shoe is you're stepping on bacteria, dog crap, all this stuff, and then you're going to walk around your house with it? No, they don't. They think that's disgusting. But in Western culture, to us, that's like It's no biggie. That's a normal thing. But when you think about it, something as simple as that could bring that into your home. So you need to know how to safely take all that stuff off without getting it on you. And you need to have a bucket, just dump it all into a bucket with water and bleach. And then you take a shower and then you pull that stuff out and freaking hang it up to dry and you're good to go. You know, there's different methods for doing that. But, you know, that's a simple, quick, easy one. All these people I watch running around with face masks, with eye shields, with gloves on, they'll touch everything with those gloves on. They'll get in the side of their car and they'll start driving away. And as they're driving away, you see them pull the gloves off and throw out the window. Well, if you did touch anything contaminated, you just touched your steering wheel, threw your gloves away, and now you're touching the steering wheel with your bare hands, which you're going to eventually touch your face with, or you're going to touch your piece of food that you picked up. Because right now, a lot of places, that's all you can do is, you know, essential items. They won't sell you luxury items if it's, you know, not food, water, or certain items of clothing. Some stores won't sell it. They can't. You know, they're under order and they don't want to lose their business license and all that stuff. So they're going to restrict you. Which I think is BS. You know, if I want to go freaking get a kayak so I can go kayaking because there's nobody out in the lake, well, I should be allowed to do that. But they don't see it that way. A lot of places you get arrested if you go out on the lake because you're violating the self-quarantine thing, but you're nowhere around anybody. So right now, if the wording and the way the CDC, World Health Organizations, is saying things is making you uncertain because they themselves are uncertain, I personally think they're unsure where this is at, whether it's a warning or a pandemic, which, you know, I'm in between. I'm leaning towards number one. But I know how things mutate with viruses, especially the flu, so I could see that next week it changes up into an actual pandemic. Even though they're calling this a pandemic, it's not. Like very, 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 very few people are infected, and even smaller are actually dying from it. And we don't know the actual numbers on it because, you know, if you've looked into that, you'll see that a lot of the death certificates have been falsified. And that's another story for another video for later. You could do your own research on that and figure that out. And that way I don't have to do a video on it. But right now, if you're uncertain, start taking precautions if you haven't already. If you've been